Good morning. We're in 2 Kings. Chapter 15. As you've noticed, no doubt already, sometimes the account will sort of park and talk a lot about one particular king. We'll see this with Hezekiah, of course. And then other times it's just bang, 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 almost just in succession listing kings. And that's what you see a little bit more of in chapter 15. I believe we just mentioned, I'm positive we didn't get into chapter 15 because I've got a note to start with chapter 1 or verse 1. But the first 7 verses deal with Azariah, and I think we did mention that this is, do you remember his other name? The more familiar name? Uzziah. By the way, don't confuse him with Uzzah. Who was Uzzah? Not Aaron's son, but yeah, it was kind of close to that time. When David was transporting the ark, this was actually part of our Hebrew history study, but this is pretty early in Hebrew history. David, remember the Philistines had come against Israel. This was during the time of, 1 Samuel 4, so still during the Judges. So still during the time of the Judges, the Philistines had attacked Israel. Israel was not right with God, and so they're defeated. And their solution was not repent and get right with God. Their solution was, well, bring the Ark of the Covenant. That's why we lost. Bring that out, and now we'll win. Religion in a box. It's like they thought the ark was some kind of magic talisman or something. So they bring it out, and what happens? They lose again, and not only do they lose, but the ark gets taken. And then some years later, David is going to bring the ark back, and he doesn't, for whatever reason, he doesn't consult the law as far as how to transport the ark. It's riding along, sitting on a cart. These oxen are pulling it. And Uzzah is the one who, he looks up and the oxen stumbled, the text says, and something happened and it jostled the ark. And Uzzah's thinking, well, I'm going to steady the ark. And so, of course, he touched the Ark of the Covenant that was not allowed, and he fell dead. Don't confuse him with Uzziah, who is also known as Azariah. And that's the first 7 verses here of chapter 15 in 2 Kings. If you want to read the account, again, we'll come to it at some point, but if you want to look at the account a little more detail, it's in 2 Chronicles 26. This is a king, Uzziah, Azariah, who started well. He started as a good king. Unfortunately, he ended badly. We're not really told did he ever, I guess I'm getting into the Chronicles account a little bit here, but I think it's worth mentioning. We'll just say this as a brief summation. What did he do there toward the end that we would say he ended badly? Does anybody remember this? The account in Chronicles, it specifically says when he was strong, his heart was lifted up to his destruction. We sometimes use the expression in the South, you get too big. What's that expression? You get too big for your britches, right? He got to thinking he was something else, apparently. We sometimes even use the expression, you start reading your own press clippings, right? You start thinking, boy, I really am something else. And he was. It was through God's grace and through God's help that he was something else. I mean, there are a lot of great things that are detailed about his reign. Great gardener. He invented these war machines and things like that. But he got to thinking of himself too highly, and he, in that state of mind, decides, I'm going to just waltz right into the temple and burn incense. And the priests, give them credit, they had the sense to oppose him. And he becomes angry, and even as the anger rises, leprosy rises. And so he becomes a leper till the day of his death. I say we're not told because I would like to think that maybe this got his attention. And even though he was a leper till the day he died, he couldn't change that. That leprosy was there. And we are told that he was a leper till the day he died, but he could have changed his spiritual state, and hopefully he did. But we're not told one way or the other on that in either Kings or Chronicles. But you get into verses 8 through 12, the focus is going to shift in chapter 15 here, back up to the north. So 38th year of Uzziah. By the way, Uzziah or Azariah, he began to reign at 16 years of age and reigned 52 years. He had a long reign. And what a shame. You know, I know I want to cover a lot more, but every time I read about Uzziah or Azariah, I think about how sometimes it happens where you see people who obey the gospel in young adulthood, and they serve God faithfully for many years, and sometimes in old age they fall away. And I think, what a tragedy, because you're that close to the reward. You're that close to, like Paul saying, I've fought a good fight, I've finished my course, I've kept the faith. And to turn away at that point, but that's what Uzziah did, at least at some point. Again, I would like to think that maybe the leprosy got his attention, and hopefully he turned back to God. I don't know. But, boy, what a shame. Is that not heartbreaking to see somebody that long a reign, that prosperous a reign, and he lets it sort of go to his head, and he does something very foolish in trying to go into the temple and burn incense. I don't think I mentioned this, but by the way, of course, the sin in his offering incense is that he was being king in the south. He would have been from the tribe of Judah. Every king came from that tribe, right? David's lineage. And the only ones allowed to offer incense had to be from the tribe of Levi. The Levites, they handled everything pertaining to the service in the temple. So the focus shifts to Zechariah, verses 8 through 12. Zechariah reigns in Israel. He only reigns for 6 months. You see this detailed here in just these few short verses, but the end of verse 8 tells us it was just 6 months. Of course, he's in the north, so we know he's going to be an evil king. He's not faithful to the Lord. Doesn't depart from the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. Again, I told you, it's almost every single time it says this about those kings in the north. So then you have a conspiracy against him with Shallum, son of Jabesh. So they smote him before the people, slew him, and then Shallum, of course, is going to reign in his stead. And the rest of the acts of Zechariah are written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. And this, of course, is the word of the Lord which he spake to Jehu. Your sons will sit on the throne of Israel to the 4th generation, so it came to pass. Then you have Shallum, who is the son of Jabesh. This is the guy who conspired against Zechariah. So verses 13 through 16, you'll see the reign of Shallum in Israel. Well, not to be outdone by Zechariah, he's only going to reign for 1 month. You see, again, a lot of upheaval, a lot of turmoil in the north. Sometimes you see this in the south, but especially in the north. And even in the south, as close as it came with the situation with Athaliah, you still see that Davidic line, the line of David that continues. Every king is a son, a descendant, a direct descendant of David. But here you have Shallum, who has taken out Zechariah, and so now he sits on the throne, but he's only going to be there for a month because this fellow Menahem, son of Gadai, he goes up from Tirzah, came to Samaria, smote Shallum, and reigned in his stead. And so, of course, it just tells us that the rest of the acts of Shallum and his conspiracy, they're written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. Now you have Menahem. He smote Tifsah and all that were therein and the coast thereof, because they opened not to him. Therefore he smote it. And even you see how brutal a fellow he is. All the women therein that were with child he ripped up. Now in verse 17, you're going to see this fellow Menahem reign in Israel. He's going to reign 10 years. So he actually establishes himself on the throne for a decent period of time. This is the 39th year of Uzziah, or Azariah, king of Judah. And so again, he's going to reign 10 years, end of verse 17. And this account will go 17 through 22. And what happens here, again, he's in the north, so he's not a good king. You see that phrase repeated at the end of verse 18. Departed not all his days from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. And Pul, the king of Assyria, came against the land. But Menahem is going to give him 1,000 talents of silver, that his hand might be with him to confirm the kingdom in his hand. Basically, he's, in a sense, making himself like a vassal. Hey, look, we'll do whatever you want. Have some money, here's some silver. Just don't come and, conquer us, basically. And it's interesting because you're basically owned by Assyria at that point. You might as well be conquered. It's just kind of a matter of semantics, right? But anyway, they don't actually come and set military forces against the city or the nation because he sends this tribute. But he's going to exact money of Israel, even the mighty men of wealth. Verse 20 tells us, every man 50 shekels of silver to give to the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria turns back, stayed not there in the land. Well, he's taxing the people to bribe the king of Assyria just to leave him alone. It's kind of sad, and never turns to God. You see this sometimes with even the kings in the south. Hezekiah, of course, when we get there, we'll see that Hezekiah actually is going to turn to God for help. But the rest of the acts of Menahem, they're written in the book of the Chronicles, the kings of Israel. And then you're going to have Pekahiah, his son, who will reign in his stead. By the way, I didn't mention this. Hopefully it goes without saying, and I think you probably already know this, but I don't want to just assume. Zechariah that we mentioned, verses 8 through 12, that's obviously not the same Zechariah as the prophet. It's obviously not the same Zechariah as the one we talked about in the context of Athaliah, when Joash was set up as king, and he had Jehoiada the priest who helped him and kind of guided him. And then when Jehoiada dies, his son Zechariah was a prophet, and he's a prophet that actually Joash ends up having murdered, having him killed. That's a different Zechariah. Zechariah the prophet is a different Zechariah than this king here in Israel. So, but again, he was assassinated into Jehu's line. Shallum is remembered for being a brutally cruel man. Menahem we remember for taxing the people to pay off his bribe to the king of Assyria. And then you get to Pekahiah, verses 23 through 26. He's only going to reign 2 years. Of course, he does what's evil in the sight of the Lord, does not depart from the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. But a captain of his, we might say like a general, one of his military leaders, Pekah, son of Remaliah, conspired against him, smote him in Samaria, in the palace of the king's house, with Argob and Arieh, and with him 50 men of the Gileadites. And he killed them and reigned in his room. And of course, the rest of the acts of Pekahiah are written in the book of the Chronicles, the kings of Israel. 52nd year of Uzziah, verses 27 through 31, you're going to read about Pekah and his reign in Israel. He finally sets himself up, first one in a while, to have a pretty decently long reign in Israel. 10 years, I suppose, is a decent amount of time for Menahem. But Pekah is going to reign 20 years. He's going to be, I've got a note here, and I don't think that's right. Let me see here. Yeah, it's not. I don't know what I was doing there. Sometimes you write something down, and I don't know what I was thinking. I've got a note that says he's the last king of the north, but that's not right. I think I got myself thinking that. Looking at verses 27 through 31, I remember looking at these notes, and I remember seeing that I just missed it, and I guess I didn't correct it in my notes. Of course, Pekah is going to do what's evil in the sight of the Lord. He does not depart from the sins of sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. Verse 28, you see this again. This is what had me thinking this originally, and I wasn't paying attention at first. And I guess I just didn't delete it out of my notes. But in the days of Pekah, king of Israel, came Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and he took Ijon, Abel, Beth, Maacah, Genoa, Kedesh, Hazor, Gilead, Galilee, all the land of Naphtali, and carried them captive to Assyria. This is a carrying away of some captives from Israel into Assyria, but this is not the fall of the northern kingdom. That's going to happen in verse 17, or chapter 17. And Hoshea, the son of Elah, made a conspiracy against Pekah, the son of Remaliah, and smote him and slew him and reigned in his stead in the 20th year of Jotham, son of Uzziah. Isn't that interesting? All of a sudden they call him Uzziah. They've been calling him Azariah the whole time. Sometimes it gets confusing, and I realize that, and you have to keep these names straight. And sometimes sometimes I've had people ask me, how do you keep the name straight? Sometimes it's just study, and just get familiar enough with them that it just kind of, you think Azariah, Uzziah, Joash, Jehoash. Sometimes that's about the only way to do it, is just familiarity. But the rest of the acts of Pekah, written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel, and then verses 32 through the rest of this chapter, through the end of this chapter, verses 32 through 38, you're going to shift back to the south and talk about Jotham and his reign in Judah. I don't understand what I was doing here. I was looking at my notes. I apologize. Sometimes you look at something and you go, what? I had last king in the north for Pekah, but then I have a note here. Assyria comes during his reign and takes some captive, and then like a subpoint that says the utter fall of Israel will come during Hoshea's reign, chapter 17. But anyways, he's not the last king. He's the next to last king. Pekah. Hoshea will be the last king in the north. So verses 32 through 38, you have the reign of Jotham. It's in the second year of Pekah that he comes to the throne. 25 years old when he began to reign. He reigns 16 years. He's going to do what's right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father Uzziah had done. Now again, they're calling him Uzziah. That's Azariah. Howbeit the high places were not removed. The people sacrificed and burned incense still in the high places. Again, sometimes a king is seeking the Lord, but the people are so far gone that the everyday common people, they're not seeking the Lord. Sometimes that's hard to legislate all the way down to every single individual. The nation will, for the most part, follow the leadership, but there are some that they're not going to follow, and they're stubborn, and that's going to continue to be a problem for Judah, just like it was for Israel. So the high places weren't removed, but he did build the higher gate of the house of the Lord there at the end of verse 35. The rest of the acts of Jotham are written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, verse 36. And then in those days, the Lord began to send against Judah Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah. They get together, and they're going to go after Judah. Of course, there's a lot of ongoing war between Judah and Israel, and sometimes Israel will get an ally to join them in that battle. Jotham slept with his fathers, was buried with his fathers in the city of David, his father, and Ahaz, his son, reigned in his stead. Now you get into chapter 16, and this whole chapter deals with the evil, exceedingly evil reign of Ahaz in Judah. Yes, sir. It's just like a rhetorical question. It's just like, hey, if you want to read more about this, isn't it in the, and the obvious answer, yeah, it's there. And when it says that, the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, I don't think I can say this with 100% certainty, but it seems to be a reference to what we have in our English Bibles, the book of Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Because you see a lot of similarity between Chronicles and Kings, with the main difference being when you look at Chronicles, Kings bounces back and forth, north, south, and sometimes you have a lot about somebody from the north. Chronicles I'm not saying it ignores the northern kingdom, but it deals a lot more with the southern kingdom. So that seems to be what that reference is. Now, when it says the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel, that's a different book. That's some kind of uninspired chronicles for the kingdom of Israel. But yeah, when it asks that, it's just a rhetorical question saying, hey, if you want to know more, that's where you can find it. So Ahaz's reign is evil entirely. By the way, Isaiah, if you read Isaiah 1:1, you'll find out let's just hold our spot and go to Isaiah 1:1. Isaiah prophesied during the reign of Ahaz, but not just the reign of Ahaz. He covered several kings. I'm going to forget one or two of them if I say it off the top of my head off memory. So let's just look and see. I know Uzziah is one of them. The vision of Isaiah the son of Amoz, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. So Isaiah's prophesying started in the reign of Uzziah, continued through Jotham's reign. That may be part of the reason why Jotham was, for the most part, a good king. Ahaz, he wasn't able to do anything with wicked Ahaz, of course. And, of course, Hezekiah. And we'll read more about that when we get to talking about Hezekiah. It's interesting when you study Isaiah, if you studied it with the account here in chapter 16 of the reign of Ahaz, you would learn that Ahaz, as I said, he was an exceedingly wicked man. He is the king to whom Isaiah 7:14 was prophesied. He was told, ask the Lord for a sign. And all of a sudden he feigns piety and says, well, I don't really feel like I should ask the Lord for a sign. Let me tell you something. If a spokesman, a direct spokesman for Jehovah Almighty comes to you and says, ask the Lord for a sign, you know what you need to do? Ask the Lord for a sign. Don't try to all of a sudden play like you're Mr. Righteous. Oh, well, I don't think that would be right for me to ask the Lord a sign. But, of course, he goes on and he says, the Lord himself's going to give you a sign. What was that sign? Does anybody remember this? Isaiah 7:14, one of the cornerstone passages. Modernists hate it. They do everything in the world they can to late date it, to try to say, oh, well, it doesn't mean what it says. Behold, the virgin shall be with child. And the American Standard 1901 has it a little more accurately translated. It not that it's inaccurate in the King James, but the King James says, a virgin shall be with child. A virgin shall give birth to a child. The ASV says the. It makes it even more specific than that. The virgin shall be with child. She's going to bring forth a child. So that's prophecy, of course, of the virgin birth. But that prophecy was made to Ahaz when he was told, ask the Lord for a sign. He says, well, I'm not going to ask the Lord for a sign. And Isaiah says, well, you're going to get one anyways. And here it is. So that would have been around 750 B.C. Of course, the northern kingdom is going to fall around 721, 722 B.C. But if you have any doubts about the wickedness of Ahaz as a king, just look at, he's going to reign, of course, 16 years, I mentioned, verse 2. But just look at verse 3. He walked in the way of the kings of Israel. Yea, he went up to the kings of Israel. Yea, and made his son to pass through the fire, according to the abominations of the heathen, whom the Lord cast out from before the children of Israel. That's a very nice way of saying he burned his son alive in worship to an idol. That's the kind of man you're dealing with Ahaz. In fact, three different times in the book of Jeremiah, God says of this Molech worship, he says, I didn't command it, and it never even entered into my mind. It's as if God is saying, this is unthinkable that you would take your precious child and burn him alive, worshiping an idol. There were warnings against it in the book of Leviticus 18:21, Deuteronomy 12:31. And God told them, you do this abomination, you're going to have big time problems. There are two things, and I've said this before, there are two things that will cause a nation historically in the Bible to fall, and fall hard. One of them is homosexuality. You see that with Sodom and Gomorrah. God didn't put up with it. The open practice of homosexuality, the advocacy of it. But number two is infanticide. God says of Judah, you see it also some with the nation of Israel, the northern kingdom, but especially here, the southern kingdom. Here you have a king who would lead the nation in such an abomination. And God says, you will not stand when you do that kind of stuff. And you think about those two things, and it's scary to think of for our own nation. where we are in regard to both of those sins that God has brought such swift and sure judgment in times past. So, again, Ahaz, exceedingly wicked. He sacrificed burned incense in the high places, on the hills, under every green tree, verse 4. Rezin, the king of Syria, Pekah, the son of Remaliah, they came up to Jerusalem to war. They besieged Ahaz, but they couldn't overcome him. But at that time, Rezin, the king of Syria, he's going to recover Elath, and he's going to drive the Jews out of Elath, and the Syrians came to Elath and dwelt there unto this day, at least to the time of the writing of this book. So Ahaz then he sends messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I'm thy servant. I'm your son. Don't you want to take care of your son? Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Syria and out of the hand of the king of Israel, which rise up against me. So Ahaz takes the silver, the gold, and the house of the Lord. Well, it doesn't matter to him, right? He's worshiping his idols. Might as well take that silver and gold out of God's house. And then the treasures of the king's house and send it for a present to the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria listens, and he goes up against Damascus. That was the capital of Syria. He took it and carried the people of it captive to Kir and slew Rezin. So Damascus, Syria, falls here. He got this alliance with Tiglath-Pileser, who's the king of Assyria. But there's something interesting that happens here. When King Ahaz goes to Damascus to meet him and no doubt thank him and play up to him a little more, he's really laying it on thick here. He knows which side his bread's buttered on, we would say in the South. And boy, he's just falling all over himself to compliment the king of Assyria and all this. And he goes to Damascus, though, to meet with him, and he sees something there. He sees this altar that Tiglath-Pileser has. I guess it was some kind of a portable altar they had made so he could worship his god, little g god, false god, out there on the field. So, his God would give him the victory. But he sees it. Ahaz does. And he says, man, I got to have me one of those. So Urijah the priest, he sends to Urijah the priest and says, hey, here's what it looks like. And can you make me one of those? And Urijah, this good, faithful priest, I'm being very sarcastic. And what's the word? Facetious. He says, sure, I can build that. So he made him one before he even got back from Damascus. Oh, Ahaz, he's jealous of Tiglath-Pileser's altar. He wants one. So Urijah says, I can do that, and he builds him one. So when the kings come back from Damascus, he saw the altar and approached to the altar and offered thereon. Isn't this great? Now I can just offer on my own altar. Burn his burnt offering, meal offering, drink offering, sprinkle the blood of his peace offerings upon the altar. Well, he can do whatever he wants. It doesn't matter. It's an abomination because it's not according to God's teaching. He brought also the brazen altar, which was before the Lord, from the forefront of the house, from between the altar and the house of the Lord, and put it on the north side of the altar. He's moving the brazen altar now. He is brazen, isn't he? And so he commanded Urijah the priest, saying, upon the great altar burn the morning burnt offering, and the evening meal offering, and the king's burnt sacrifice, and his meal offering with the burnt offering of all the people of the land, and their meal offering, their drink offering. Sprinkle upon it all the blood of the burnt offering. All the blood of the sacrifice and the brazen altar shall be for me to inquire by. He says, you use this pretty altar that I have had made for all the sacrifices. And I'll use that brazen thing. I'll use it to inquire by. He just Burger King religion right here, isn't it? Have it your way. Just doing whatever he wants. And so Urijah the priest, again, you see his lack of backbone and spine. You got those priests in Uzziah's time that they actually withstood him, and they said, this doesn't pertain to you, Uzziah. You can't do this. Not Urijah. He says, hey, you want it, king? You got it. So he cut off the borders of the bases, removed the laver from off them. So he's moving stuff. He's just rearranging all the temple furniture. I don't know if he thought it was boring or what, but he makes all these changes with the temple furniture. Here, 17 through 20. The culvert for the Sabbath that they had built in the house in the king's entry. Without, he turned from the house of the Lord for the king of Assyria. The rest of the acts of Ahaz are written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, verse 19. So he slept with his fathers, buried with his fathers in the city of David, and Hezekiah his son reigned in his stead. Sometimes I read this account still after all these years, and I find myself saying, how did good old King Hezekiah come from that rotten rascal? Because he was. I mean, he did his own thing. It didn't matter what God said. It didn't matter what the law said. He's going to do his own thing. Ahaz. But it shows you may come from rotten, spiritually rotten parents. But you don't have to be like that. Hezekiah is going to follow God. You're going to learn from, well, you learn it from Ahaz. Ahaz came from King Jotham, who was a good king. You can come from spiritually great parents. But if you choose wrongly, it doesn't guarantee that you're going to be faithful to the Lord. So that's one of the overarching lessons that you see throughout Kings and Chronicles, is that sometimes you see good parents and maybe even train their children, but their children, when they reach a certain age, they're accountable to themselves and for their own soul. And sometimes they unfortunately choose not to follow God. Now, sometimes the parents don't train them. The child still has a responsibility when they reach adulthood. They can still seek God even if they weren't trained, because you see with people like Hezekiah, didn't have good parents, but he still followed God. So a lot of good lessons there with that. Let's look at chapter 17. I know we're running short on time, but I want to cover this. I was telling Bob's going to fill in for me in a couple weeks, and I wanted to, chapter 18 and 19 go together, so I want to get through 17, and then, Lord willing, next week we'll cover 18 and 19 together. I don't want to split those up because they all deal with Hezekiah and the siege of Jerusalem by Sennacherib, king of Assyria. So chapter 17, the first 5 verses, you have the reign of Hoshea in Israel. For 9 years he reigned. By the way, I can say now, he is the last king of Israel. He's the last king. King Shalmaneser of Assyria is going to make him a vassal king. What's the word in the King James? ESV has vassal. Servant is what the King James has. Against him, verse 3, came up Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, and Hoshea became his servant or vassal and gave him presents, money, tribute, in other words. But here's what happens. The king of Assyria finds conspiracy in Hoshea, as he sent messengers to So, king of Egypt. He says, hey, I'm supposed to be sending all this money to the king of Assyria, but I could be sending money to you, and you could come help me and give me troops, and we'll rebel. And Assyria, the king of Assyria says, oh, no, you don't. Where's that tribute? Well, give me a little more time. He's trying to buy some time, no doubt. See if he can get Egypt to help him. And the king of Assyria says, nope. And he comes and shuts him up into prison. And then he lays siege to Samaria for 3 years. By the way, this shows the strength of Samaria militarily. I mean, their king is put in prison. They still last 3 years of a siege. Isn't this interesting, by the way? I was thinking about this just this morning. One of the things that we worry about a lot in military conflicts, and especially if you ever study Civil War history, it was one of the things that early on in the Civil War, it almost turned the tide and cost the Union the war. Everybody was thinking this thing's going to be over. The Union is going to just smash the Confederacy. And there was, I need Justin here because he's my resident Civil War guy. But there was a battle and it was a crushing Confederate victory. Anyways, it was pretty early in the war. And all of a sudden, the Union folks realized this isn't going to just be over in a snap. And morale just sunk. And they start thinking, I don't know if we want to get into this. And especially when re-election came around for Lincoln, it was really dicey getting re-elected because people were going, hey, this was supposed to be over by now. All that just to say, we talk about when can we get the troops out of Afghanistan? When can we get the troops out of here? These ancient kings, they would lay siege to cities for years. And it's just like nobody even blinks at it, it seems like. I don't know. I mean, we're not given a lot of detail, but that's just interesting to me. But anyways, I was thinking about that this morning. So he lays siege to Samaria, the capital of Israel, for 3 years. It takes 3 years for them to fall. because Hoshea quit paying tribute and he's trying to hire Egypt for help. But you see the strength of Samaria here as far as their military strength. Verses 6 through 23, you see the fall of Israel. You may want to write a note in your Bible. This is somewhere around 722, 721 BC. That's just a good reference to have. Bob is going to be working on getting you some charts that I have those, and I had not thought about it, and he and I were talking about this, and I told him, I said, man, that'll be awesome if you get that, and it'll help you kind of place everything visually on a timeline. But this is one of those big dates in Old Testament history, and especially Hebrew history, of course. The nation of Israel fell in the 9th year of Hoshea. Many are carried away captive. Verses 7 through 23 basically detail why this happened. Stubbornness, rebellion, idolatry. And really all that could be summed up in one word, idolatry, because that's what idolatry is. It is stubbornness against God's will. It is rebellion against God's will. And it's setting something or someone on the throne other than God. And when you do that, there is but one fate, and that's spiritual death. It's going to turn out bad every time. Judah isn't far behind, according to verses 19 and 20. They're not going to fall for about 150 years, but it's not like they're shining examples at this point. In fact, they're going to be more culpable. You'll see later on some of the prophets point out, because they should have learned from the mistakes of Israel when Israel fell. Verse 23, the nation of Israel was still in exile at the time this book was written. And then verses 24 all the way down through 41, this is where Assyria is going to resettle Samaria. They took a ton of people captive. They're going to put some more people back in the land. This, by the way, when you read in the New Testament, you read about this group of people that are hated. They're despised by the Jews. And what are they called? Samaritans. You ever wonder, where did the Samaritans come from? You don't read a whole lot about them in the Old Testament. This is the origin of the Samaritan race. Foreigners are brought in to the nation of Israel, and the idea here is, by the king of Assyria, his thinking is, well, if you bring in foreigners, they all have to intermingle together. There's no sense of national identity. There's no national affinity, and so they're less tempted to rebel. That's the idea, at least. The people don't fear God, though, so lions come in, and they're killing people and causing all kinds of havoc. So somebody tells the king, well, they need a priest there to teach them to follow the ways of their God in their land. They think God is some kind of a located God, Jehovah God. So they say, send some priests over there. So he sends some priests. But listen, what kind of religion do you think corrupt priests are going to bring? It's going to be corrupt religion. And that's exactly what happens. So this is the origin of the Samaritan race. They began to call them the Samaritan people because they were sent into Samaria. They began to intermingle, and so some of the Jews had this idea, well, you're not even wholly Jewish, you're just half Jewish. And this idea of being like a half-breed. And they really disdained the Samaritans. The Samaritans, for the most part, pretty much felt the same. There was no love lost either way, usually. But the Samaritans, this corrupt religion that they have, there actually is a book called the Samaritan Pentateuch. And it's where they took the Pentateuch, which is the Jews' law, the law of Moses, and they rewrote it. And what city does everything in the Pentateuch center around? At least the main city. God's going to put his name there. What's the city? Jerusalem, Zion. Guess where everything centers in the Samaritan Pentateuch? Samaria, or Mount Gerizim. Instead of Mount Sinai, you've got Mount Gerizim. There's all these changes that are made to fit the Samaritan religion. So that's kind of interesting. But basically, that's where the origin of the Samaritan race is. And to sum up the rest of the chapter, the people still made gods, little g gods. They worshiped idols. And they try to say they're following God. But it doesn't work that way. You can't say, God is my 1A and my idols over here are 1B. God's either first or he's last in our hearts. We might say, in fact, I have a note here in my notes, does this sound familiar? People want to worship their gods, serve their gods, and then say they also serve Jehovah. We sometimes use the expression 1 foot in the world and 1 foot in the church. But you can't do it. It doesn't work. No man can serve two masters. You'll love the one, hate the other, hold to the one, despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. That's the origin of the Samaritan race. They tried to have one foot in the world, one foot with the Lord, and it just doesn't work. They were wholly unfaithful. We'll stop there and pick up next week with chapter 18 and chapter 19 and see Sennacherib, having conquered Israel, he sets his sights on Judah. And he says, I'm coming for Judah, and I'm going to conquer them. We'll see how that plays out, Lord willing, next week. Thank you very much. The 5th, right? Next week? January 5th, next Sunday?